Welcome to the OCHA Country Office Surge Pool webinar for humanitarian financing. I'm going to start by letting you, the participants, let us know where you're joining from. I find WebEx a great tool to interact with. So why don't you start using the chat? If you're in front of your computer on your phone, let us know which country office you're joining from through the chat. While you're doing that, and let your colleagues know where you're joining from, because maybe Orla has the grand list, but I'm not sure everyone knows who else is on the roster with them. I'm going to let Marisabel start and introduce herself. Over to you.
Thank you, Samir. Hello, everybody. My name is Maria Isabel Castro. I am working with OCHA's country-based pool fund section in New York. I'm Humanitarian Affairs Officer and work in the Fund Management Response Unit. We are in charge of providing support to all colleagues in all 18 countries where we have country-based pool funds. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Marisabel. And I am Samir Mahmoud. I am a program officer in the SURF Secretariat, mainly in the program unit. I'm also the training coordinator, so I'm lucky enough to work often with Marisabel on some joint training, some joint briefings. So yes, I agree. Very happy to be here, and thanks for joining. So I'm just going to go back to the chat and see where people are joining from. So I have colleagues from South Sudan, Yemen, Addis, Syria, Colombia, Afghanistan, CAR, others from Syria, Myanmar, the Philippines, CAR, and from DRC. So just a quick glimpse. If you check your chat, you'll see where your colleagues are joining from. So you're all on this surge pool. I think it's one of the cool directions that OCHA is going in. So we're going to do our best to have more of a conversation about humanitarian financing and see if we can give you the essentials, not the full picture, because that's quite a big picture, the essentials for surging out, because this is a surge pool. And quickly, I talked to Orla, and she mentioned that the surge could be any number of situations. It could be a surge to a sudden onset emergency. It could be a surge to a country with a country-based pooled fund, a humanitarian financing unit. So we're going to keep that in mind as we go along. There's different kinds of situations. But first, I still want to have a bit of a conversation, and before we get into the details, the technical aspects. And maybe I was asking Marisabel before, what is relevant, what's important to know about for someone going out from one country office to the next. Let's say they land in a country with a country-based pool fund. Many of you are already in those countries, but let's say you're not, or you go to the next one. What's important, Marisabel, to know for staff who go from one OCHA country office to another one in, let's say, a country-based pool fund process?
Okay, very quickly, and if you have any questions, please feel free to add them in our chat. Important to know about country-based pool funds is that we are managed at country-based in comparison to SURF, and that all funds, we have 18 funds in the world, in 18 different countries, and all funds are managed by a humanitarian financing unit. So these units are part of OCHA's country office, but just to let you know, they have a separate budget, and they have a fund manager who is in charge of managing the country-based pool fund. They have a whole team in terms of monitoring. They assist the head of office, they assist the humanitarian coordinator, who is the one who takes final decisions, strategic decisions, approves projects. So in case you go on search to support a country-based pool fund, to answer your question, Samir, they will probably only work within the humanitarian financing unit to support the functioning of the country-based pool fund.
Cool, thank you. Thanks, Marisabel. So I wanted to draw a bit on Marisabel's experience and all of her experience working with teams that have, or staff who have surged out to the many funds. And then we're going to try and get to hear from you. I think I'd like to also hear, we'd like to hear from you. And there's tons of experience. I mean, the amount of experience in OCHA is always impressive. So why not utilize it and let others hear about it? Because yes, we can talk about the technical details all day long, but I think you guys bring some experience. So maybe it'd be nice for other members of the search pool to hear from you. So I'm going to give a chance for a few of you on the line. I'm going to take a risk here and check that some of the sound is working. Samantha, you've searched out quite a bit, and maybe you could give us a bit of your experience on SURF. So I'm going to ask Samantha I'm going to unmute Samantha, and maybe give us one experience that you've had, share a little bit with the search pool staff, maybe say one or two things that you noticed or that you found useful when you go out. Samantha, over to you.
Hi, Samir. Can you hear me first?
Yeah, if you could speak up just a bit, it would be great.
Okay, so I suppose just a bit of background. I used to work in the regional office in Bangkok, and I'm now with OCHA Libya. So a lot of my experience has been deploying to rapid onset natural disasters, where one of my roles has been to basically to facilitate a SURF application process. And so an example of that, now I'm just trying to think of one, would have been in Papua New Guinea, where they had an earthquake, and there was agreement with the SURF Secretariat before I arrived in Papua New Guinea that there would be a SURF allocation, and a rough envelope had been agreed in those discussions. And so my role was to, in support of, we didn't have an OCHA office there, so I was working with the resident coordinator's office to facilitate the application process. And that was everything from the initial discussion with the cluster coordinators on how the allocation would sort of be split, what the priorities should be, and then working with the partners who were agreed to put in projects, to work with them on actually filling out the actual submission itself, because many of those agencies were not familiar with the process. So as part of that process, we also did I suppose a small introductory training to explain, what's the SURF life-saving criteria, what projects were acceptable, what maybe fell outside of the scope, just so that they kind of had a bit of an idea of how the project proposal should work in terms of what could and could not be funded, and then doing an initial review of the projects before they were, I suppose, submitted to the RC's office, and then supporting the RC in making the final submission to the SURF, and then working both with the sectors and the SURF Secretariat on facilitating any comments or follow-up actions that needed to be taken for the final submission to be made. And so I was there for approximately 2 weeks for the surge mission, and during those 2 weeks I was probably working on that proposal the whole time, with sort of the first week being focused on the initial submission, and then the second week on working with the follow-up questions from the SURF Secretariat to get those proposals finally approved.
Super, thank you very much for sharing, Samantha. I just wanted to get a little bit of an example, some experience shared before we get into the technical. So I think with that, we're going to move into talking about some of what Samantha mentioned, some of what Marie-Isabelle mentioned, and give you really a big picture of humanitarian financing. Now, as I mentioned, there is this incredible, enormous world of humanitarian financing. When it comes to OCHA, there are really two tracks, if I could say that. One is the system that brings money in, and then there are the two tools, country-based pooled funds and SURF, the pooled funds that move that money to the humanitarian emergencies. So that's quite clear. Now, what we're going to zoom in on, of course, is that part on the pooled funds, the SURF and CBPFs. Now, I should mention, and Maria Isabel is going to talk a bit more about this, that there is a very strong connection, of course, to appeals, humanitarian response plans, and flash appeals. And that'll be important for staff who surge out to keep that in mind, especially in cases where there is a country-based pooled fund, and for SURF, when there's something called, if you're working in a situation where there are underfunded emergencies grants. So there's some strong connections to HRPs. And that's, again, very high level, big picture. Now, there are several steps, and maybe I can cover the SURF aspect in hand. So we had just a low bandwidth, believe it or not, in New York headquarters. I think there's some challenges with the amount of people online here. Nonetheless, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to just move forward. So again, to make the most out of everyone's time. So just a quick connection to the humanitarian program cycle. SURF is a part of all of them. There's, of course, the application, the resource mobilization, the movement of money, grants, but then there is a role, and you could be in this role to help with the monitoring, which is an interim update. It's really an update on the SURF projects. And of course, then there, towards the end, it's a little bit less about peer review. It's more about evaluation. It's more about reporting. There is a final report, which you may be asked to help with. You may be asked to help with a report that for an allocation that you had very little to do with, or that you weren't there, and then there would need to be a lot of coordination, a lot of facilitation, as Samantha mentioned. Maria Isabel, over to you on how the humanitarian program cycle is connected to country-based pooled funds.
Maybe one of the biggest differences between SURF and CBPFs is that country-based pooled funds only operate in countries where there is an OCHA country office and when there is an HRP. Country-based pooled funds allocate almost 100% of the money to HRPs. Wherever it's being prioritized in the HRP can be funded through a country-based pooled funds. However, our teams in the different countries, they do a prioritization within the HRPs together with the clusters to prioritize the activities that need to be funded. We are also flexible in case there is a sudden emergency and it's not part of the HRP. We can, of course, provide response to any sudden emergency at any time, but the key part of CBPFs is that we should be aligned with HRPs because we think CBPFs are like an excuse to enhance coordination, to bring actors around the table, the main stakeholders, to discuss priorities, to see what is the best response needed, and to provide humanitarian financing. So important is, even though you don't do search to work directly with a humanitarian financing mechanism, but if you have to support, for example, the development of an HRP during the search mission, it's important that you know that that's going to be critical when it comes to humanitarian financing.
Super, thank you, Maria Isabel. So lots of connections to the humanitarian program cycle. And we're going to move quickly to the main topic for today, our OCHA's managed instruments. So as we said, SURF and country-based pooled funds. Now we're going to go even further into the differences and similarities, but here's just a glimpse of some of the differences between the two types of pooled funds. The SURF is really one of the ERC's tools, whereas the CBPFs, country-based pooled funds, are more of humanitarian coordinators' tools. UN agencies are eligible for SURF, and they subgrant to NGOs, but then UN agencies and NGOs are eligible, and then it's a global fund versus a country-level fund. I've already started to mention some of the things on one of the main slides that Maria Isabel and I wanted to focus on. So I'm going to hand back over to Maria Isabel to talk about country-based pooled funds, and then maybe her and I can go back and forth on what are the differences, what are the similarities. Can we start with the differences?
Sure.
Although there's very few differences between us, we are like siblings, but we noticed that there are some important similarities and differences. Over to you.
So starting with this table, one of the key differences is also the funding target. As I mentioned, CBPFs are aligned with HRPs, so is our funding target. We have a very ambitious funding target, which is we should fund 15% of the HRP funding in a country. We have only reached this in one country so far. It's a huge, a very ambitious target, as I said. It comes from the World Humanitarian Summit, and all our teams in country, they work really hard to reach this target. But you know better than us, I guess, that the underfunded level of HRPs is everywhere, and therefore also to manage to really reach the 15% it's a big deal. We are always discussing about this funding target with DRS, with Donor Relations Section in Geneva, and some country-based pool funds, together with humanitarian coordinators at country level, they have decided to adjust that funding target to the specific context. So within the 15%, they say, I think we will only reach 10%, this is our target, but globally is 15%.
Okay, and then maybe I can talk about some of the similarities. Well, I think Mirsabel has mentioned the difference is SURF is a global fund, meaning that we're able to fund humanitarian emergencies with, of course, UN agencies in country, or sometimes some cases that are not in the country yet, versus the 18 established country-based pooled funds. And we're going to show a map of where they are. So where you might end up. Now, some of the main similarities, the UN agencies are eligible. So when you go to and perhaps work on either a SURF or CBPF allocation, you'll be working with the agencies, the partners, as Samantha mentioned. However, there is this difference where you'd be working maybe more closely with NGOs in a country office with country-based pooled funds. Allocations are they're both designed for sudden emergencies, sudden onset emergencies, and protected crises. There's a small loan element of SURF, don't worry about that. And of course, prioritization. Prioritization is one of the main things that is challenging about both funds. There is, as Maria-Isabel mentioned, huge requirements for HRPs or emergencies, appeals, flash appeals, and SURF and country-based pool funds tend to be a small amount. We say at SURF that rapid response funds jumpstart an operation. So you can imagine in an emergency, what is the amount needed to jumpstart? Unlikely to be the full amount. In some cases, it's a higher percentage, but unlikely to be the full amount. So prioritization is one of the main jobs of somebody surging to work on a pooled fund allocation and support that prioritization process.
And maybe on this one, sometimes where there's a country where we have country-based pooled funds and SURF, the teams have decided just to enhance collaboration, to go through the same process. So they sometimes use the same process to prioritize projects or activities for SURF and for country-based pooled funds. In some countries, when there are both funds, sometimes it's the same person in charge of managing both funds, both allocations. In other countries, even though there is a country-based pooled fund and there is a SURF allocation, we might have SURF managed by the intercluster coordinator who sits with OCHA, and the country-based pooled funds is managed by the fund manager. But we expect from here, and I think it happens, that they coordinate at country level to enhance collaboration and to have a greater strategic added value of both funds.
Thank you, Maria-Isabel. Absolutely. So again, you'd be maybe surging to a situation where you could be working with the HFU, you could be working with the intercluster coordinator. Just be prepared to be in several different situations. And then finally, the approval process. Samantha mentioned that she was working a lot with the SURF Secretariat because SURF projects are approved at the headquarters level by the ERC. There's a letter and he must sign for money to move. So that's our overall objective, is to have that letter signed. Whereas for country-based pooled funds, it is signed, it is managed, it is approved by RCATs at the country level. So Again, a lot of similarities, but some detailed differences. Now, we have a few slides that go even further into detail. Some of the basics that there are, of course, CERF is a global fund for UN agencies, and as I mentioned, kickstarting emergencies, operations, and then to address critical gaps. This is underfunded emergencies. Several of you have probably worked in operations that have received an underfunded emergencies grant. So that could be a place where there's a staffing gap, a need for a surge, and you would be working on something called underfunded emergencies. We normally speak in terms of RR and UFE, and those are some of the main things to consider. Maybe some examples of rapid response. Papua New Guinea from Samantha was one example, and currently I'm working on allocations to Guatemala and Honduras. Is there a sudden onset emergency there? No. There's a food security emergency. Drought has affected both countries. So now we've given, the ERC has given 5 million to each. So someone might be asked to go and support SURF allocations that are for slower onset, more protracted type of emergencies. And I'm going to hand over to Marie-Isabelle to talk about some of the basics. And many we've mentioned of CBPF.
Yeah, maybe just to mention it again. Country-based pool funds are established by the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mark Lowcock. Here, when do we establish a country-based pool funds? It depends. Sometimes humanitarian coordinators contact us and they raise the need to establish a country-based pool funds. We always have to do a scoping mission. Country-based pool fund section from New York goes to the field, to the specific country. We just, for example, finished a scoping mission in Venezuela. Last year, we went to Mali. For example, after visiting Mali, we decided there are the criteria that have to be there, like we need an HRP, we need a strong coordination mechanism, we need strong clusters, we need also donor commitment. We noticed those criteria were not really fully there, so we recommended against the establishing of a fund in Mali. Whereas last time we went on scoping mission to Ukraine and we established last year a new fund. So, but it's a longer, heavier process in comparison to SERF. So we do need a country office in place, HRP, strong clusters in order to be able to establish a country-based pool fund. Contributions come from donors. Right now we have reached again one other record, almost 1 billion in 2019. And we allocated over 1 billion in 18 countries. And donors, they just put their contributions into a country-based pool fund to a specific country. They decide, okay, I'm going to give 10 million to Afghanistan, 20 to Syria, and 5 to Yemen. And that's why we call it softly earmarked. And then within each country, the humanitarian coordinator, together with what we call the advisory board, which is this coordination mechanism that we have where we bring together donors, UN agencies, national and international NGOs, and of course OCHA, they decide how to allocate this money. And this is also one of the added value, that everything happens at country level. I would like to mention here that country-based pool funds are the biggest donor to national NGOs globally. Last year, I think we have reached around 26-29% of our allocations went to national NGOs.
Super. Thank you very much, Marie-Isabelle. I think we are going to move closer to a question and answer period. First, we wanted to show, and I'll of course let Marie-Isabelle kind of give a quick overview of where the funds are. I mean, so you mentioned some of the new funds. What are some of the largest funds? So perhaps where the most needs for help are.
Where I was mentioning, we have allocated last year 1 billion in 18 countries, targeting 75 million people. We could discuss about this figure of targeted beneficiaries because it's really, really big. it has for sure double counting. We are trying to improve that figure. This is also again related with HRPs, right? If the quality of HRPs is also good quality, the quality of our figures is going to improve. We are working on that. We have signed contracts with 757 partners in all countries and more than 1,600 projects. As I was mentioning, the last fund we opened last year was Ukraine, and it's also one of the smallest. Myanmar is also one of our smallest funds, but is growing. All funds are really, I'm talking about Myanmar. I know Weiwei is there. I don't know, I don't have the exact amount, but I guess it's around 10-15 million fund. Then we have Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and of course the biggest one for the last 2 years is Yemen with more than 200 million allocated.
Super, thank you.
We are just
to
close it. We are also closing Pakistan this year. The decision was made last year. And this also goes again together with HRP and OCHA strategic priorities. OCHA decided to close down or to reduce the country office in Pakistan, and therefore we also, because we can't operate without OCHA in country, we are also closing Pakistan. And last year we closed Colombia also.
Super, thank you. All right, Isabel. So there you have it, the 18 funds. So keep that in mind that you might be searched out to the 18. In comparison, SURF, as we mentioned earlier, is a global. There is a tremendous amount of overlap in allocations to countries with country-based pooled funds. You can see that Yemen has received quite a bit of SURF. This is SURF since its establishment in 2006, and there have been allocations to many different regions. I think the amount of SURF allocated to the Latin American Caribbean region has increased. The amount of SURF to African region, Africa West and Eastern, has probably been similar to the past or even increased. So the SURF could be really where there's a humanitarian emergency. One example I wanted to show, where there was no office, and I think it was the first time we'd allocated in 2019, was to the Bahamas. So the Bahamas had a major emergency or a major storm and Hurricane Dorian, and then the UN had a very niche response. So just an example of some less traditional SURF allocations, and that would be, for example, the allocation to the Bahamas. Now, if you want to know a lot more, I think there's two really cutting edge kind of tools. One, and I have to be completely honest, that the country-based pooled fund section has a much better business intelligence than we do. So if you'd like to see some really cool movement of charts, and you hover over the screen and you get all kinds of really interesting information, there is the pooled fund business intelligence. There's the site. SURF has revamped its website several years ago. I think it's quite good. The tools that you need to apply are on the SURF website. So program officers go there. We don't email them anymore. We say, this is the page where you have your tools for all those parts, for application process, monitoring, that interim update, and guidelines, tremendous amount of guidelines for final narrative reports. And then something we came out with, because we don't have such a cool BI, the SURF handbook a few years ago is a short handbook, useful tool. We try to make it nice and light for you to kind of, again, big picture, with a lot of links to other sources on our website, and some of the kind of founding documents. That's really it for the presentation portion, and we've been joined by Orla. Orla's in the room, so I'm going to make it challenging for Orla and say that you can ask us questions, but also, if they're relevant and connected to humanitarian financing, ask a few of Orla. So with that, I'm going to hand over to you guys, the participants. Let us know what kind of questions you have about the presentation, about what you've heard from us, or otherwise. Now, you can unmute your microphone, or even better yet, let us know through the chat. Send us your question, or let us know that you even have a question, and then we can take some turns answering. This is your opportunity to ask about humanitarian financing in general, humanitarian financing if or when you're surged on the country office surge pool, and really get to know the details from the sources, the differences on SURF and CBPF. So I'm going to let everyone have a few minutes. Feel free to ask. Again, it's even easier through the chat. So let us know your questions. In the meantime, I'm going to look for participants with experience. And Blaze, you seem to have raised your hand. Blaze, if you'd like to come on, go ahead, unmute your microphone and let us know your questions, your thoughts, your comments. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the brilliant presentation. Yeah, I've got two questions to ask. The first one, I just wanted to know whether there is any instance where SURF is allocated to a country that has just been hit by a rapid onset emergency, but where there is no cluster arrangement in place. How does prioritization take place in such a country? I don't know whether I was clear about that. And the second question was to do with emergency cash grant. It was mentioned in the last WebEx. You did not mention it today, so I just wanted to know whether there is anything that you can tell us about emergency cash grant. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Liz. Those are two excellent questions. As I mentioned, there are many SURF allocations to countries without coordination structures. However, in most cases, there's a resident coordinator and there are UN agencies. There's a UN country team. So we give the responsibility, the accountability, and actually the ultimate accountability of the use of the funds, and we even say the strategic use of the funds, another fancy way of saying the smart use of the funds, lies with that resident coordinator. So resident coordinators and country teams have really used their existing structures. I think it's yes that there's been challenges for teams that have had to shift from development mode to humanitarian mode, but we ask that the RC lead a process with the country team, with the UN country team, to prioritize. Now, especially, many OCHA regional offices are supporting countries without humanitarian coordination structures. So you might have an opportunity, or you might work with regional office staff who are kind of bringing in knowledge, people like Samantha who have experience from regional offices on how to coordinate. In the end, everything we say, everything that the ERC donors and our guidance says is that this needs to be needs-based. So whether there's as strong a structure as in a long-standing humanitarian operation, in the end, it still needs to be needs-based. So we would look for the best available information from assessments, etc., and then we would look for it to be prioritized. In the end, we don't want cake cutting. That's one of the big things that's kind of a signal of poor prioritization, unlikely strategic use, and really less based on need. And sorry, your second question was on emergency cash grants. I've done a webinar recently with the Latin America team, the OCHA ROLAC team on emergency cash grant. You know, that although it's about money, it's quite kind of funny. It isn't necessarily within the realm of humanitarian financing. It's a much smaller scale, and I think probably Orla could even speak more to it. These are for smaller scales. I know, for example, in Argentina, there was some discussion on a very small group that a population that needed help, but it wasn't on the scale of SURF. One thing very technical that might help kind of clarify that is SURF and agencies don't accept grants of $100,000 or less. Emergency cash grants, I think, are in the realm of 50 to 100, right? So if you think of the emergency cash grant scale to here, and then SURF being, you know, much higher, going from 100 to we have projects of several million. You can imagine the size of projects in Yemen or Syria. So Blaise, I hope that answered your question. And it's not a one defined answer for your UN country team question, but there in the end, it's kind of the same requirements. Blaise, does that sound like we were able to answer? I was able to attempt to answer your question.
That's good for me. Thank you very much. Yes.
All right,
Thanks.
you. Super. Thank you, Blaise. Other colleagues on the line with questions for Maria Sibel. Yeah.
Hey, Samir. This is Malaku from Ethiopia.
Go ahead.
I have a question about country-based pulp fund. I mean, it's based on the decision is based on the advisory board, especially the allocation depends on the decision of the advisory board. And in a strong, intercluster coordination system in a country like Ethiopia, how does the cluster coordinators inform, the allocation methodology? I mean, like, how can they have access to the methodology, the decisions, and the overall process before it is, announced? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So what we expect normally from fund managers is that they coordinate with cluster coordinators. There are different processes, but in general, what happens is that the fund manager talks to cluster coordinators or to the intercluster coordinator to have an initial sense what the allocation should be about. If they want to prioritize a specific region or a specific cluster, so that they can come up with a concrete proposal. Of course, after discussing and working and sitting around the table and checking the HRP, what are the funding levels? Also, do we have humanitarian access? Do we have partners that can receive the money? Do they have the capacity? Do we have capacity to monitor? What are the risks associated? So they have to consider different factors. Once they have a draft allocation strategy with the different priorities that they have to outline and to justify, what we expect is that this document is discussed with the clusters and it's presented to the advisory board. In some countries, cluster coordinators themselves, they need to go to meet the advisory board and defend. It's like a thesis defend, like your master thesis. They have to really go in front of the HC and donors and the members of the advisory board and defend why they are proposing that allocation. That happens sometimes before projects are reviewed. Other times they have to defend when projects are prioritized, because sometimes we get a list of 30 projects and we have only money for 10. So there is always accountability, and it should be a transparent process. Our 5 principles are inclusiveness and accountability, in addition to efficiency and effectiveness, and I always forget one.
We'll look it up in the meantime.
But just to let you know that we really try to, and that's why sometimes it takes long, because we are inclusive. We want and we have to involve clusters, donors, national NGOs, international NGOs. When there is a sudden emergency, when there is rapidity needed, so we don't have time, people are in an emergency, they are dying, and we really need to respond quickly, this process is faster. The HC can decide, I'm going to allocate 10 million in this region for organization A, B, and C. There is no consultation because we don't have time, but this is for sudden emergencies. So in our, for surface underfunded rounds, we call them more or less standard allocation. So we should be involving always cluster coordinators.
Thank you, Maria Sibel. I'm going to get to a question on the chat, so thank you, Wei, for using the chat, and others, please ask your questions through the chat. The question is, as far as I know, SURF is a quick process. How long does it take starting from the application to disbursement? Excellent question. And for sure, one of the main strengths of SURF is speed, and I'm going to continue to push that we are fast and encourage you when you are searched out and you're involved in a SURF process, the application process, that time is of the essence, and we are known for speed, we track speed. So the applications come as a package. So you can imagine a package of 5 projects: UNICEF, FAO, WFP, UNHCR, UNFPA. That is from the resident or humanitarian coordinator. That is kind of when we are timed on how quickly disbursements happen. Most of the time, we have some comments, some budget lines need to be clarified, maybe some activities need to be clarified, and then that goes back to the agency. So if you were sitting in the country office and you were the liaison with the SURF Secretariat, it would be imperative that you say, guys, we need to turn this around fast. Of course, you need the money fast to jumpstart, kickstart, as we mentioned, those operations. But you can be a driver, and I think Samantha, I know Samantha has been one of those drivers in the past. So you can be a driver. If all goes smoothly, I'd say from application to disbursement, we've seen things on average, perhaps 2 weeks. We've seen things happen in the case of Mozambique in a matter of days. So you can imagine the scrutiny, the media scrutiny on an emergency like a Mozambique, like about Hurricane Dorian. Those kind of things are super fast-tracked, but we are also concerned with the speed of things that are for, let's say, the locust, the response to the locust emergency in Africa, flooding in different parts of the world. So we are still, although it's not a internationally televised or scrutinized event, we are still very conscious of the time. So a few weeks. Now, I'm going to move on to Laura's question. Hi, everyone. This is Laura from Colombia. I just want to know, once a CBPF is closed, is it possible to reestablish this fund? And what will be the process for it?
Hi, Laura. Just to let you know, I was the fund manager in Colombia, so that fund really is very close to my heart. Well, it's not only our decision. We also had this or similar questions coming from the country office last year after the decision was made. The answer is yes, it could be reopened, but we need to fulfill some criteria. What are the criteria? Are there humanitarian needs? Do we have the support, not only political, but also financial support from donors? Because what happened with Colombia at the end is that we were managing a 1 million fund that required still, even though it was only 1 million, a lot of work from the country office at HQ. So, and we expect that funds reach at least now 10 million, as it was the case for Ukraine, and we are getting there. And also it's a decision that has to be made in collaboration with OCHA here in New York. It has to be in line with OCHA's strategic focus in terms of Colombia. What does OCHA expect in Colombia? What is our role in Colombia? Do we really need a fund there? Why do we need it? So it's a very political and high-level decision. We were in conversations because we are aware about the changes after the peace process, the peace agreement, and the Venezuela situation. So the answer is it could be reopened because we are here to provide humanitarian response when it's needed, but there are other criteria that we will need to talk about them.
Thank you, Marisabel. So we have a question from Danya. What are the procedures of these SURF allocations? Are they similar to CBPF? I mean, UN agencies will apply through allocation papers or like ad hoc projects. Well, maybe I can start by mentioning the SURF application process. So there is agreement, let's call it a green light from the ERC. Very much of what SURF is funding is already vetted, and we've had several discussions. And I think that's an important thing. Another practice that Samantha used is to connect yourself to the SURF Secretariat, connect yourself to CBPF section when there's questions. But for SURF, for sure, there's been a green, or in the case of a yellow light, then we get more feedback. Then an application package is put together. It is projects, as I mentioned, perhaps 5 projects with a chapeau are sent to New York. The prioritization may or may not use country-based pooled fund system, but again, that would be in 18 out of the, well, SURF is funded over 100 countries, but on average 40 different countries per year. And then the review is done here in New York by program officers, and the feedback is between New York and the field versus, and that's what I'm going to hand over to Maria Isabel, a slightly different CBPF system.
Maybe let's add here one important point is that SURF and CBPFs, we are using the 8+3 template. If you're not aware what it is an agreement that was reached in the World Humanitarian Summit to reduce reporting requirements. And we are using that at the application level and at the reporting level. So we have worked together to trying to harmonize what we expect from our partners when they apply to SURF or to CBPFs. However, the templates look a bit different, but we are getting there. And we are still different funding mechanisms. That's why also we need to have differences. Our process, as I said, happens at country level. There is an allocation strategy paper, which is a document that puts together the key priorities of the allocation, how much money are we going to allocate, where, when, which sectors. This should be consolidated with clusters, and then it should be approved with the support of the advisory board that brings together donors, national and international NGOs, UN agencies, and OCHA. And then the humanitarian coordinator is the one who will take final decisions. In most of the cases, we always receive more projects than we can fund. So our teams in country, we don't have anything to do with that in New York. This is a process that is managed by our teams in countries. They need to prioritize. We have a scorecard where to try to be as objective as possible. And there are also other criteria because we are a mechanism that supports national partners. So if we have an international NGO that is applying for the same region as a national NGO, and we think both have the capacity and both have the knowledge and the expertise, we always try to prioritize national NGOs whenever possible, of course managing risks. And the very final decision happens at country level. We will never, from New York, we will never say you can't approve this project, only if there are cases of fraud or where there are investigations going on, but the whole process happens at country level.
Thank you, Maria Isabel. So some clarity on where the decisions are made, country level or here in New York. So it's very much related to a follow-up question from Melaku that asks, or says, thank you for your feedback on my question on cluster engagement on CBPF allocation process. Another question on prioritization. According to the enhanced HPC, the HRP is fairly prioritized and no need for further prioritization. In this case, how would the SURF and the CBPF align to this new guideline? How could the HRP be used as a prioritized document instead of further prioritization? I can speak from the SURF side that prioritization is the #1 challenge. Hands down, the most difficult thing that we ask. We put OCHA offices, we being SURF Secretariat, in very challenging positions, and I had some very honest feedback, but these are some of the most difficult positions people have ever been in. There have been, to use a nice term, fights in some prioritization meetings. Yes, intercluster coordination meetings, and that's understandable. This is about resources. These are, as Maria Isabel mentioned, in places where the HRPs are very poorly funded. The decisions are still, and the prioritization still remains field-driven. I think that is something that some have issue with, that SURF is not more hands-on, that isn't guiding the decisions more, because that would resolve perhaps a lot of that or take the pressure off. However, if the HRP is prioritized and that's applicable for a sudden onset emergency, then the connection would have to be very clear. In the case of underfunded emergency grants, so there's 2 rounds per year, the operation has been determined to be very poorly funded, the vulnerability to be very high. We're funding DRC again this round, Honduras, Guatemala, Haiti, several countries. Some have HRPs, some don't. Those with HRPs, the projects need to be HRP projects. So yes, that is a tool to use. But the difficult answer is that it's really field driven up to the country team. Ultimately, the accountability with the HC. So I do hope, and I'm learning a lot about it myself, that this new HPC, this enhanced HPC, is going to make that process easier. We are probably going to need to think about whether or not we can incorporate that into some of our guidance. But you are the most experienced people when it comes to this, because you're on the ground, you're working with HRPs and the HPC all the time. This is a tool, and this is where you have influence as a country office surge pool member. The more knowledge, the more briefings, as Samantha did, that you bring into the conversation, the better, and the more perhaps efficiency, if there's already been some prioritization in the HPC. I'm going to hand over to Mr.
maybe
Bell.
let me add something to this, because it's the same we have the same challenge. But to your question, even though there is a really good HRP in country, let's keep in mind the HRP in comparison to what we can fund is really huge. So there is always going to be the need to prioritize within the HRP. An HRP can have billions of humanitarian financing requirements, but we only have 20, 30, 50, 100 million. So, and this is for the whole fund in a year. So we are talking about funding rounds, allocations within a year for 5 million, 10 million. The biggest allocation we have had is in Yemen. I think it's 80 something, or it was now Afghanistan. So there is always a need to prioritize within the HRP. There is no way we can only use the HRP as the framework to decide to allocate money. But if there is the quality of the HRP, as I said, is going to make our lives easier because regions are clear, sectors, the activities that they prioritize, targeted population. This is going to help us a lot in terms of defining our allocation priorities.
Thank you, Marisabel. We still have questions coming. For those of you who can stay on the line, that's fantastic. I'm going to maybe take one, maximum 2 more questions in the interest of time. There's a question on what the criteria are other than the nature of the emergency for having a loan grant. I think you may be talking about the SURF loan. The SURF loan is a very specific aspect of SURF that is normally at the headquarters level. There's been just some sizable loans to WFP and FAO, if I remember, that are being paid back, and of course in the past have been paid back. It's something that very few OCHA country office staff are connected to. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the loan. The loan, I think right now the maximum is 30 million. There's some outstanding loan being repaid, but really out of 500 million that we allocate, that's not even included. So 30 million is really a small portion, and it's mostly at the agency level. The agency may connect it to a particular country office or operation. Any more questions? I'm also, again, going to offer, since we're close to the end, questions for Orla about the connection between the country office surge pool and humanitarian financing, the different roles. While you're thinking of your questions, and you've been excellent at using the chat, while you're thinking of your questions, I'm going to ask for some help from a participant that I asked about before. Samantha, I wanted to ask you for maybe 2 pieces of advice that you'd give, since you've surged out before, to staff when they do surge out. You know, what are some of the big things that no one tells you, that might have been a little bit surprising, that someone could prepare for before they surge out. So Samantha, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Samir.
Tough question, I realize.
No, I mean, I think some of the best lessons that I have learnt, usually the hard way, is that first is don't expect that anyone in the country that you're going to, including the RC, understands what these mechanisms are. I would go in assuming that they don't and then be surprised if they do, because if you assume that they understand and they don't, it becomes very difficult very quickly to move through these processes, particularly when you're talking about a SURF proposal in a rapid onset. The second one is I would, and I don't know about country-based pooled funds, but certainly for SURF, I would always have a time frame. So like a little chart that tells you when things are due, like a timeline document, and make sure people agree to it so that you can then have some accountability in terms of following things up, because deadlines will always slip, particularly when you're talking about either a rapid onset or even if you're deploying to a situation that has deteriorated. People are going to be really busy, and if you don't agree on timeframes up front, they will slip really quickly. And my last one is use the people in New York, both SURF and the country-based pool fund. They've always been super helpful.
Super, Samantha, thank you. I think those are great pieces of advice. Okay, thanks so much, Samantha. I think that's really, really important to go into an emergency assuming that not everyone, or maybe very few people, know OCHA's humanitarian financing tools, CBPFs, and SURF. Yeah. Orla, I'm going to give Orla maybe the final word.
No, thank you, Samantha. I mean, and just good morning, everybody. I mean, just building on that, that's why it's so important with these WebExes on all the different aspects that we don't often get time in our daily work, but that the OCHA role, you know, the responsibilities, and, you know, we are seen as the people who should know actually all of these tools that we have, because we are in support and service to the humanitarian community and to the resident or humanitarian coordinator. So I just really urge you to really use this time, use these weeks, you know, to really update yourself. You know, we have the Microsoft Teams website. We are putting a lot of information, and there are a lot of the presentations. Building on what Samantha says, reach out to colleagues like Samir and Isabel and others, say when we come to the protection WebEx, when we come to the comms WebEx, you know, this is what we are all here at headquarters for. We are here to support all of you at the field level to be able to do the job that you need to do, and particularly more so when you surge. And some of you on the country office surge pool are already surging. So it's really critical that we do this together, and that there is so much knowledge available at your fingertips that you can utilize. From my side, so just please make sure you're all on the Microsoft Team website. In terms of, I sent a mail earlier this week, we are looking at surge for Gaziantep and Idlib, so it's critical that you update your profiles on the surge platform, your availability, because I will simply not have time to be reaching out to people. You know, are you available? Please do it so I can see it straight in front of me. The link is on the Microsoft Teams website. The next WebEx, of course, is next week, the 10th of March. It will be on communications and advocacy. So again, think about what your role is as a surge person. We all, of course, are advocates for OCHA, for the humanitarian community, and for all the issues that need to be, you know, elevated at critical times in any response. So please think about this beforehand. Just don't see this as, oh, this is my once a week WebEx I have to do. Think about it, build on it, you know, use the information, etc. And then for those 24 people that are attending the first training in Norway, please confirm your travel as soon as possible. Please also, if you think there's going to be any issues, and I say this in light of the coronavirus, If you think there's going to be any issues with your travel, please let me know now so that I can offer your place to someone else who may be able to utilize it. Please confirm your bookings, etc. to Joanna in Geneva. And if there's anything else, just contact myself and Cathy. I really want to say thank you to Samir and Isabel. I think this is a critical component of OCHA's work, and we all need to know about, humanitarian financing, not least because there's also a lot of changes ongoing. So it's really important to have that base information before we move forward. So thank you, Samira. Thank you, Isabel. That's it from my side.
Thank you very much, Orla. And thank you guys for staying a little bit past the time. Thank you for your participation. Great questions. I think Maria Isabel and I are in agreement that we are happy to answer questions. I think maybe to make the communications, next week's webinar theme, streamlined to certainly go to Orla, and then we're happy to respond. So when you're surged out, not if, but when you're surged out, we are here. That has been one of the keys to success, as Samantha mentioned. Thank you very much for your time, guys. That brings the webinar to a close, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Upon the update, upon the updates, seulement, please update your profile. Je vais. Oui, j'ai fait un bel email. C'est un update.